Okay. Good evening. Good evening, everybody. And a very, very warm welcome to this beautiful hotel. And thanks to the Waldorf for hosting us here this evening. I'm Peter Ainsworth. I have the honour to chair the Heritage Alliance. And I hope we're in for a really interesting evening. It's just as well you've turned up, because actually without you, there wouldn't be much point in organising an event like this. So thank you so much for coming. We've got some wonderful panellists as well, including, you'll hear from later, Faith from the Ecclesiastical Insurance Company, who have very generously sponsored this evening, and we're deeply grateful to Ecclesiastical for doing that. We'll hear a little more from her later. We at the Heritage Alliance have been pretty busy on this whole kind of environmental agenda for really quite a long time. And we've had some successes. Quite recently, we've had conversations, for example, with DEFRA about ensuring that the heritage bit of what constitutes the natural environment is very much recognised by government. We have got that into the 25-year environment plan, which we reckon is a very good thing indeed. There's more work to do on the Environment Bill, where it isn't currently recognised, but who knows what any bill is actually going to do or go, or if, at this time. So, well, it's no laughing matter. Okay, it's a sniggering matter. Oh, by the way, this whole thing is being live streamed. So we all have to be much more careful than I just have been about it. And also, you're encouraged to tweet or Twitter or whatever it is that people do these days. And the addresses are up there somewhere on the screen. So that's all good. I mean, I declare an interest because I've been banging on about climate change for really rather a long time, and I am a member, and have been for a long time, of Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth. So I have attitude about this, but so do the people behind me. I know that, and we're going to be hearing from them very soon indeed. It just seems to me, very simply from a heritage point of view, that reuse and repair is always going to be better than new build. I mean, we need to build new buildings, but where we can reuse old buildings, that's always going to be better for the environment, better for heritage, better for places, making places more beautiful and lovable and beautiful places, I think, tend to make more lovable and beautiful people, which is a good thing societally as well. So it's not just environment, it's not just heritage, it's a social good too, in my opinion. Lizzie Clitheroe-West, our brilliant chief executive, and I had a very, very good meeting recently with the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, because we don't just deal with DCMS, we try to range across government, because it's across government that we will make most impact, who really gets the idea of the heritage part of the government's housing programme. And I thought that was very positive. That was a very positive development. There are lots of opportunities for our members, I think, here. I mean, a lot of them own quite a lot of land. A lot of them do sustainable farming, for example. And, as I say, there's a huge opportunity to contribute to regeneration projects and that sort of thing. But it's not without difficulties either, because obviously, there are a lot of large and small, very leaky houses, for example. It's not everywhere that you can bung in PVC windows, for example, even if you wanted to, which I hope most of us probably wouldn't. Locomotives, other forms of historic vehicles. You can't plug those into some kind of electric thing outside Tesco's. So there are some real challenges here, which is why we want to have this debate. And we want it to be a proper debate, so don't feel that you have to agree with everything that everybody says, because that's not what a debate is. Think of it as a sort of, question time without Fiona Bruce. And now, let me introduce our panellists. We have here David Saddington, who, is, in my notes, it says he's popular and young, which kind of it's a bit annoying, isn't it? Don't you think? That's what it says, anyway. But you make your minds up at the end of the evening. He is a passionate advocate on the subject of climate change. And I very strongly commend, if you haven't seen it, his talk, which you can find on YouTube, called Why I Don't Care About Climate Change. It's very, very good indeed. He's shared platforms with heads of state all around the world. But this evening, even better, he's sharing a platform with our second speaker, who's Keith Jones. And Keith Jones is, it says in my notes, the man who makes the National Trust properties greener. He has a long-standing and distinguished career as a broadcaster and advocate for all things green. He also has an abiding interest in ketchup, which you may want to explain a bit later on. Then we have two doctors in the house. I'm sure there are rather more in the audience as well. Hannah Fluck and Meredith Wiggins from Historic England, Head of Research, and the Environmental Analyst at Historic England, who, if she falls asleep, there's a very good reason for that, because she's been travelling, offsetting the carbon emissions, by the way, and didn't get any sleep today. And then we have Tim Heatley, who co-founded and runs a business called Capital and Centric, which specialises in redoing mills and old buildings, particularly in the Manchester area, in a very sustainable way, with due attention to their eco-qualities and to energy saving and so on. The strapline of the business, I looked at it, is we're property developers. We take mundane spaces and create brilliant places, which is, I thought, rather wonderful, because normally it's kind of we're property developers, we take the money and run off. God, I'm not doing well, am I? And then at the end we have Faith Kitchen, who is representing our sponsors. She's the Heritage Director for Ecclesiastical Insurance, 20 years experience in the business. And Ecclesiastical is an incredible business, actually. It's an ethical insurance company. Can you get your head around that? And it's owned by a charity. And a huge amount of money, I think £60 million since 2016 or something like that, has gone from their business into the charity and distributed across charities across the United Kingdom. So please give a very warm welcome to all our panellists. And let's now hear from David Saddington. Thank you very much.
So my journey started back in the middle of June in 2005, and it was after a scorching summer's day out at my parents' at a heritage property, actually, in Duncan Park, a beautiful Baroque hall in Hemsley in North Yorkshire. And it was at the end of this scorching summer's day out that this event happened, and this was one of the worst floods on record to hit my community in North Yorkshire at the time. And since this event happened back in 2005, many worse floods have actually happened. And it was this event which stimulated my interest in climate change as a teenager. So heritage has been part of my sort of climate change story since the start, as it were. But it's also a very stark reminder that the heritage sector is very much at the front line when we talk about climate change impact, so whether it be from increasing flood events, rainfall, extreme heat, expanding pests, for example. You know, our precious heritage properties very much are at risk from the climate impacts we will see in the coming decades. And let's just take stock for a minute and think around the context of the climate crisis we find ourselves in today in 2019. Because for the entirety of human civilization, right back to our oldest heritage properties here in the UK, we have had a remarkably stable climate for thousands and thousands of years. Our civilization very much is built on the foundation of a stable climate. And within the past 100 years, these foundations have been collapsing, and they will indeed continue to do so in the decades which come because the impact of the climate crisis now is so severe. And that's something we do really much very need to recognise, the urgency and the emergency of the climate change crisis which we find ourselves in, and acknowledgement of how it will very much affect our historic properties and our landscapes. But of course, the more optimistic way of looking at this and the journey ahead of us is of course the framing of net zero, which is a remarkable target, and the UK is very much leading the way in this. We're the first country in the world to set this target into legislation. I'm sure many countries will follow. And this journey to net zero is truly remarkable. It represents an absolutely astounding journey we are about to go on. This next chapter in humanity is game-changing. If you're not worried or excited by net zero, you haven't properly understood it. It's absolutely remarkable what this change will be. We will be the first generation ever not to rely on burning things to produce energy. Right back from Neanderthal man to the Industrial Revolution, we will be the first generation not to rely on burning things to produce energy for everything we do, from lighting rooms to moving around our country to visiting the heritage properties you curate. So it is truly, truly remarkable. And in this journey, I'm confident, and that's why I'm here tonight, that heritage can very much lead the way in this. And this is just one example. This is one of my favourite heritage properties, and we were just talking about this. It's Cragside in Northumberland, the first property in the world to be lit by hydroelectric power, and very much an innovation of its day. And I'm very glad to hear that a few years ago it's gone back to being powered by hydroelectric. A great story and a great sort of reminder of the power of heritage and bringing this back up to the current day. But of course, when we talk about the heritage sector responding to a challenge of net zero, what I really want to explore tonight is not just the tip of the iceberg, as I'll call it, of retrofitting old properties, which often gets a lot of attention because of its difficulty. But that is very much the tip of the iceberg. And when we talk about the heritage sector, we need to talk about much more than that when we talk about net zero. We need to talk around the building of new buildings as well, such as visitor centres. We need to talk around what sustainable events look like in the heritage space. We need to look at rentals, when holiday rentals are done on heritage sites. And we need to include all of this in our narrative about net zero, because it's all of this which is included, and particularly how landscapes are managed. The issue of carbon offsetting, there's huge potential for landowners, as Peter mentioned in the introduction, around meeting the challenge of net zero. And the point I would just like to make here is that heritage properties are often very much the centre of communities and can have huge influence over upstream and downstream processes in those communities. What supplies you use can have huge implications. What can you do over your entire property portfolio? What standards can you set to really lead the way? And downstream, what stories can you tell to inspire your visitors and showcase your leadership? And the final words I would like to leave you on in this opening address is just that the heritage we see today in our country is very much built on bold ideas, hard work, and preserving something for the future. So when we talk about the challenge of net zero, I'd very much urge you to think about those statements and think about the people and the places which make our heritage sector today, and think about that when we respond as a sector to the challenge of net zero. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. And now over to Keith Jones. Are you going to explain about that ketchup thing?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Climate change, carbon, climate emergency, everything is... my son, when he was 5, would only eat stuff if it was smothered in ketchup, and therefore it was ketchup with everything. Today, it's climate change with everything, carbon with everything. It's the same sort of idea in terms of, but slightly less messy. So this is what it means. This was a study that we did of Ham House in Richmond upon Thames about 3 months ago. What are they seeing now? 9 weeks ago, or is it maybe slightly longer, Ham House had to close the property to its staff and the visitors because the inside temperature was over 40 degrees centigrade in a Georgian mansion in London. It'll only get worse. What we then did is we mapped what does 2050 look like for Ham House. You can see that heat, you can see that water is the biggest element on site. How do we adapt? How do we deal? So the first thing is reducing our impact, reducing the carbon that comes out from the fossil fuel and everything else that we do. But it's more than that. We're seeing impacts everywhere on it. These, to me, are the canaries in the mine. These are highlighting that there's a problem. The bit on the bottom left-hand corner was a study we did with Oxford University looking at what heat do our visitors like. The blue spots are 200 million data points, or visitors as we call them, over 10 years. 28 degrees, our visitors metaphorically fall off a cliff on it. By 2050, the 2018 summer will happen every other year. So what happened a year and a half ago, you will see it every other year based on our current emissions. This is why we seriously need to take stuff down on it. A picture on the right-hand side is the Coles Hill estate. The estate wall collapsed one night, 150 metres of wall collapsed because the clay is shrinking underneath the wall there. So the drought element, that's the impact. That's what we're seeing day to day. Therefore, I'm not covering this. It's the elephant in the room as far as I'm concerned. How do we change? How do we adapt? Let's first reduce our impact on the climate itself. So what does net zero actually mean? In all of that, energy is actually quite a small component of it. Your supply chain, your investments, the staff travel to work. What do you include in your net zero? What does the government include into it? So the scope 1 is the direct element, what I'm using inside my property, how I operate. Scope 2 is the things that we use. Scope 3, it was interesting. We're using something called the greenhouse gas emission protocol. So it's a scientific methodology that gives us the figure. The lower down the chain, the scope you get, the bigger the footprint gets. But you have to remember that our scope 3, in terms of the supply chain, is somebody else's scope 1, because they're using the power directly or whatever comes to it. But you first of all need to look at where you're starting from. When people say net zero, I ask them, what are you talking about? What's in scope in your net zero vision of the country? People automatically think it's energy. Well, just wait long enough. The grid will decarbonize. There you go. Your net zero according to your definition of net zero. So there's a definition, top left-hand corner, but there's no real accepted view of what net zero actually means to it. So we're looking at, as an organization, what do we include in net zero? What methodology do we use within it? Because every almost local authority saying net zero without really knowing what it means. What are we talking about? So you also then need to think about, how do I account for it? How do I measure it? So there's a scientific protocol that we're looking at the moment, rather than making stuff up, which I'm seeing quite a lot of it at the moment across. I'm trying to see who's doing good stuff so that we can learn from. So we're currently evaluating the scientific methodology for accreditation. When we say net zero, we're going to properly mean it, rather than just say a term and then we'll go and figure it out. But there's no such thing as a new idea. So I'm sorry, this is a plug. I'm part of something called the Fit for the Future Network, which is a network just sharing. That's all we do. We don't sell, we match need with knowledge. And so it's everybody from Buckingham Palace, Crown Estates, down to small youth hostels and RSPB and everybody else. There is no such thing as a new idea under the sun. So this is what this system is trying to do. We're trying to share, but also we're trying to gain from others. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Keith. Now, we have a double act, I think. Excellent. Well, let's hear the double act.
And actually, no such thing as a new idea under the sun is probably... how do I... Aha. probably the best introduction I could ask for, because that's basically what I'm going to talk about. So we've got a bit of a double act going on here. Meredith is going to pick up in a minute and look at some particular projects that Historic England have going on at the moment, looking at carbon in the historic environment. I'm going to give a bit more of an overview. I can wax lyrical about why the historic environment is essential to communicating climate change to people. I can also wax lyrical about how it's incredibly important for adapting to future climate change scenarios. But today we're going to look at how it can contribute towards a more sustainable future and some of the really positive things that we can learn from the past. I have discovered this artist, Jill Pelto, a while ago, who does wonderful pictures with climate change data. So I am now never going to show boring graphs again, because I think it is far more interesting and in some ways compelling. This is a list of some of the risks that we are facing with climate change. And what I want you to think about is how, in adapting to those risks, how we could adapt to those in a way that doesn't involve using more carbon. Because things like overheating, well, pressures for air conditioning, that sort of thing, that's not a terribly sustainable solution. And what I want you to think about is the ways in which our historic environment in particular can help us in accommodating and adapting to some of these changes in a sustainable way. And this is to make me not go on and on as I flick through slides, so I'm stuck with this one before I pass over to Meredith. But the point of this collection of images is that we can learn not just from our built environment, which I think is often the focus of a lot of our conversations around climate change, but also from our landscapes and our archaeological understanding of places and how they have changed through time. And in actual fact, there have been quite a few changes in our landscapes in the way that we have used them, and also changes in our climate, even throughout the Holocene. Now, I'm a Pleistocene archaeologist. I deal in human evolution. I can tell you that one of the things that makes us human is our ability to adapt to quite radical changes in our environment. What we are facing now is a faster change than we have seen in the past. No human being has lived through the rates of change that we are experiencing. In terms of our landscapes, we can see what sorts of practices have had an impact on the environment. We can look at long-term changes through time, through archaeological deposits. And in terms of our buildings, we can learn an awful lot, in particular from the ways in which they've been designed and the materials they used. Now, I joined Historic England as an archaeologist, not knowing terribly much about buildings, and I have learned a tremendous amount about how incredibly sustainable, resilient, and appropriate our traditional building materials and methods and designs are for adapting to the future. In particular, earth-based building materials, lime, plant-based building materials. It's pretty much nothing more thermally effective than, I think my colleagues would say, certainly, a cob-built thatched building. That is incredibly sustainable. Those materials, in fact, will probably store carbon. It's better than carbon neutral. At the bottom, you can't quite see it here, that is the wonderful Waddensea Centre, which I sadly have never been able to visit. That is a modern thatch building. Stunning modern architecture built out of traditional materials. Lime in the centre there's an example of lime and earth structures being used as flood-resilient materials in Asia. And we know from our own research that lime mortars and plasters are incredibly resilient and recover very well from flood impacts. So not only do we know that these materials are very low carbon, but they are also more appropriate for dealing with some of the challenges we're facing, and they also combat things like overheating very effectively. So one of the other points I wanted to make before I hand over to Meredith, was that there is also a lot of debate around rewilding. So some of the solutions that we're being presented with rest in how we manage our landscapes and our places, and we're told that planting trees is good. But what we're not always told as part of that debate is that a coppiced and a managed woodland is far better at storing and capturing carbon than a wild place. And for the past 10,000 years, there probably haven't been anywhere that hasn't been affected by the impact of humans in our country. And I think recognising that and looking at how some of our landscapes can help provide some of these materials for the future is a really important part of some of these solutions. Reeds, willow, coppiced woodland, all of those things provide building materials that are sustainable as well as capturing carbon. Anyway, with that, I will hand over to...
So I'm just going to stay where I am because I don't have much time. So I'm just going to talk to you a bit about a current project that we are working on at Historic England. It's just finished, and it will be reporting on the 27th of November on Heritage Day. It's called Understanding Carbon in the Historic Environment, and this is just one project that we're working on, and I know the National Trust is working on projects. We're all working on this from different angles, and that's really what sharing our expertise is all about. So last year, Historic England and the Historic Environment Forum asked the sector what it was that they wanted to know. What data could we provide? What research could we design that would help them advocate for the places that they cared about? And carbon was the answer. That's what they wanted to know more about. So David talked about the IPCC report. I don't need to go into what it says. And Theresa May committed to net zero. We know that these things are drivers, and these were drivers of the design of this project. So given that around 50% of the UK's emissions come from buildings, and as you can see there, 80% of the buildings that will exist in 2050 have already been built, we really do know that the existing building fabric has to play a part in reaching those carbon targets. Now, the RICS gives new buildings a lifespan of 60 years. And in London, as you can see there, the average lifespan is 14, and that is just not sustainable. I mean, you can debate me on this, but I'm pretty sure that's not sustainable. So we came up with a hypothesis to test, and this is the hypothesis. You can read it for yourselves. To test this hypothesis, we designed a comparative life cycle analysis that looks a bit like this. On the one hand, you've got the new build. On the other hand, you've got the historic building. In particular, we wanted to address that 2030 goal, right? What contribution could historic buildings make in that short timeline? What could they do that new buildings can't do? So we hired Carrick Conservation International to work with us on this and designed the research to try to address the entire life cycle of the building. And we know that that's neglected in lots of estimations of new buildings. So, as I said, just to keep you in suspense, we won't be talking about the results of this project today. Sorry. But you can look at this and see how this comparison works. This is over a 100-year timeline, so at the end of that 60 years, you get a new building. Here you don't. You just keep maintaining the same building that you've got. Lastly, I'm going to do a plug for the Climate Heritage Network. Is Andrew here? Julie Polanco and Andrew Potts and Hannah are part of the steering committee. You can talk to them about this, but this is an event that's happening in Edinburgh later this week, and I won't go into any more details, but we can talk about it afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Hannah and Meredith. And our next speaker.
Thank you.
It's Tim.
Hi, folks. I'm Tim. I'm co-founder of Capital and Centric. So we're a property company. My love of nature and building started when I was a kid. I didn't have many mates, but I found out that I could entice my mates and my siblings to hang out with me if I built dens and stuff. So I used to forage for bits of timber and wood and leaves and build these dens. I never really grew up. I've always done that ever since, and and that's become a career. So we now spend £2 million a week, week in, week out, on regeneration and development. So we've grown a lot over those years since we really started to do lots and lots of additional projects. And we do stuff across loads of different sectors. And I wanted to show you very quickly is to whiz through a different group of projects and buildings that we've been up to recently, all of which use sustainable technology in the construction and also in our approach to how we build them and how we maintain them, and crucially, actually, how we manage them in the future. So I thought it'd be really handy just to kind of have a little bit of an overview. This is an old building that we bought. It was built probably in the 50s, we think, and we turned this into a workspace by reutilising the building. We were able to create a award-winning piece of architecture. We used modern methods of construction, so we assembled components off-site and shipped them into site to clip them into place, which saved us a lot of time and energy. And it uses the high thermal mass of the concrete frame, which meant that we didn't need air conditioning. We just used natural ventilation. So it takes longer to cool down in the winter, which means that you don't need as much heating, and it takes longer to heat up in the summertime as well. So, we focus on, we use things like ground source heat pumps as well to create the energy for the building. as well. And crucially, we still own and maintain these buildings, which means that we can spend that additional cash that it needs to get them from being derelict to being revitalised and reused. And of course, reusing buildings is the single most kind of energy efficient thing you can do if you're going to create a new space for people to be in and work in and live in and thrive in. And actually, if we do more if we live in cities and towns more, that's also one of the single biggest differences we can make to climate change. It's one of the most sustainable ways that we can live rather than living in kind of these wavy cul-de-sacs down long roads or much further out where you're further away from sustainable methods of transport. This is Tempest, the building in Liverpool that we acquired. And again, what I wanted to talk to you about here, apart from having all of our buildings have free electric car charging. So if you're a resident of our building, you have a free electric car charging. You need to do that to encourage people to take use of it. Otherwise, people are clearly sceptical and they just won't. We noticed there's been a big change. 6-7 years ago when we started to do that across the portfolio, they sat empty. But actually, since we've seen that take up in electronic vehicles, then we're finding that take-up's increasing, and actually we're considering maybe possibly having to charge now that the bays are really well used. But again, a concrete frame, 1960s building, using that high thermal mass again to make sure that it's energy efficient space. And also wellness is really important. So we have lots of things with yoga and thought leadership and seminars and events and activities. It's largely about people. Here I wanted to mention that we've got 80,000 bees on the roof, and we have beekeeping classes, which is great, a great thing for people to do to reconnect, I suppose, at the top of Liverpool city centre with nature. And events and activities and bringing people together, again, is a really useful way of getting people to stay in a place. You don't want to constantly clear off somewhere else and just expend more energy and time and effort on public transport. So I wanted to show you some of the events and activities that we do. Ducie Street Warehouse, this is Manchester, a derelict old mill that we've recently completed about 3 or 4 weeks ago. We turned it into hotel accommodation right next to Piccadilly train station. So in terms of sustainable location, it's ideal for walking around. Huge atrium in the middle to get natural light into it. It's listed, so that was a challenge. But again, by using tricks such as creating big atriums such as this and being less reliant upon having to burn things, as you said earlier, to bring light into a space, then it's sustainable for the future. And also, it shows that you can, with creative imagination, you can create a beautiful place for people to be, despite buildings like this sitting empty in cities such as Manchester for years on end. Things like gyms and workout equipment. Again, another way of encouraging a healthy lifestyle. Encouraging people to cycle, encouraging people to walk. This is Crusader Mill. A development of a residential conversion that's underway at the moment, and again here we've omitted the use of car parking, so we have 0 car parking in almost all of our schemes for residential purposes. We just have free electric car charging bays, and instead of car parks we have courtyards and trees and green things, which are again a much more, I think, pleasant way. But you can see use of timber. Use of planting, use of trees, reminding people actually that these things are a finite resource, and you need to be careful about what you do with them. And the reason we do this isn't out of the goodness of our hearts. We're a property development company. We need to make money in order to do it again in the future. But our consumer, which I wanted to show you here, it's really important to them that we do these things. So we do it because we need our consumer. They care about where they spend their money and and where they're going to invest and where they're going to, or if they're going to rent space off us. They care about these things, and therefore that's why we need to do it, to ensure that we continue to attract consumers to our spaces and places. A mill conversion here is another one that we're just about to commence. But here I wanted to demonstrate we're bringing a new canal inlet into the. I've got a pointer on this. Yes, I have. It's just at the bottom. A new canal that we're bringing into the space, and again, I think it's to again just encourage alternative methods of transport and encourage nature and encourage wildlife. And again, all of our buildings that are commercial are super energy efficient. They're all BREEAM excellent, and it's just a line in the sand that we've always had. We've always just built super energy efficient buildings, and again. The logic for that is that people demand it now. The consumer that's coming through, a lot of our businesses that occupy our workplaces are high growth businesses, tech, digital, creative. and they're young businesses, and they demand to be in a space that isn't going to be damaging to the environment, or can be as least damaging as possible. And again, similar things. Eyewitness Works, converting buildings. Here we acquired a whole street in Sheffield to create homes, cafe, bars, restaurants as well. Here we can see before and after, really, the difference that it makes if you can be imaginative and clever about how you go about creating communities in these locations. Actually, somebody said here, crikey, you've got to deliver a community, but we can't get people to deliver Domino's in that location. It's I'm not going to put that in the brochure, but it's pioneering or shitty, depending upon how you want to put it. But and that's what we're good at. It's about people, not property, and I think that we have to switch our mindset to think about people more. And if it's a people-focused approach to development, then the answer comes from that, and we're hearing from our consumer that it's all about. They want to know that we're creating sustainable buildings and sustainable communities. And this is Littlewoods in Liverpool, where we had a huge fire, and some of you might remember, in summer last year. And we're moving forward with plans to create film and television studios. This is the before, this is the after. And we're investing £50 million here with a higher education institute as well, and co-working space. And again, we think that in itself is inherently, I've been told, going to end. That in itself, by having film and television studios in the north, where they don't have to go up and down the motorway all the time and burn carbon and do other things, I think is another good example of how you can co-locate and cooperate with other organisations to help them bring their carbon emissions down. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim, very much. And actually very interesting to compare what you said about buildings in Manchester and what you're doing with the terrible statistic that Meredith came out with about new build in London. It's kind of almost makes me want to move to Manchester. Now, almost. So do I. Now, our final speaker is Faith Kitchen from Ecclesiastical. Thank you very much.
Hi, good evening. So I'm going to give you a very slightly different view on what you've heard tonight. So I'm going to give you the insurer's perspective. There we are. Okay, so why do the insurers care about climate change? Why is it important to us? Well, two main reasons there. One, more climate change means more extreme weather events, more severe weather events, which costs us money. So we care quite a lot about this, actually, because that cost is ever increasing. And I'll touch on a little bit of research we've done recently into the sector. Also, investment risk and opportunity. So insurers invest trillions of pounds, and that needs to fund future people's retirement plans, but also future claims as well. It needs to cover the cost of those. So actually, a disorderly exit into a low-carbon economy could have a real effect on those investments and could cause some severe changes in investment policies. So we could be sort of running low and high. And there's also an opportunity for insurers as well who look at a more sustainable investment policy as well, and perhaps a little bit ahead of the curve. So two main issues there for us. So some of the facts and the fears, and I've just added some of the headlines, and actually the one at the bottom as well from the Independent News it was actually only from last week, where I think they said the UK came closer to a Category 5 hurricane than ever before this month. And we know we see hurricanes in the Atlantic Ocean, but actually, it's going to be very, very soon before we're going to see a Category 5, I think, hit our shores as well. In terms of cost, in the UK, the big freeze period that we had in 2018 cost the insurance industry £194 million. And the subsidence claims that came as a result of the 2018 heatwave cost £64 million. And so as an industry, we invest about 1.8 trillion in invested assets, but at the moment less than 1.2% are in ESG investments and assets. Now, I will just say Ecclesiastical is slightly different to the rest of the insurance because we actually have all of our assets invested in Eden Tree, which is an ethical and responsible, sustainable investment company. But, there is more work to do there. Climate change, could it make insurance too expensive? Well, we've already seen that happen with flooding. For those of you with houses in places like Hebden Bridge, you will know that it's very difficult to get traditional flood insurance these days. And actually, the insurance industry's response to that has been the creation of Flood Re, which allows people that can't get flood insurance in the traditional market to access flood cover. So we're already seeing the impact of climate change on our industry. But what are we doing about it, and what is some of the research? So the research on the right-hand side, which I'll show you in a minute, is quite frightening, actually. So the Association of British Insurers, the ABI, of which we're a member, is our industry body, recently did some analysis into the impact of storms in the UK and how much they might increase with the climate temperature rising. And actually, it was quite frightening. We'll just go forward. So just a small temperature rise, 1.5 degrees Celsius, could have an impact of over 25% in some areas. It wouldn't be everywhere. Obviously, it's not going to hit in a very nice, even way. Particular impact in Northern Ireland, the North, and also the Midlands. Apparently, it might even be a slight improvement for the South. So I would say you might want to move south despite the house prices. If you don't like windy or rainy weather, then actually you might see an opportunity there as well. But it does actually show you just how more resilient you're going to need to be in the North, the Midlands, and in Northern Ireland as well going forward. And just briefly as well, the insurance industry has set up something called ClimateWise in collaboration with the University of Cambridge, and that's really to look at how do we make ourselves an industry more accountable as well for climate change, and what can we do to support that too. And one of those, Principle 6, is about supporting climate awareness amongst our customers and clients as well, and that's something that we try to do as well through thought leadership, insight, and the guidance that we can give you as building owners and property owners too. So what can you do? That leads me on. Well, adaptation and resilient repairs. So adaptation we've talked about a little bit tonight, but there is quite a lot you can do even in historic buildings from our experience. So there are companies that can do some very good secondary glazing. You can always change your halogen, change away from halogen to LED, and also think about where your surface water runoff might come from as well, and look at your drainage. So there are things you can do as well as just being more aware of your maintenance and your general gutter clearance and things too, but also resilient repairs. And a great example, one that we've recently done, is Turley Church, which is based on the River Severn, as some of you may know, flooded 4 times in as many years, so is really feeling the impacts of climate change. So what we did with the church there was actually take out the pews after it flooded last time, replace them with folding chairs, because they're a lot more easier to move around, which actually had the other benefit for the community, gave it a more flexible space as a church as well. We raised the organ up 7 feet on steel posts. So again, if the floodwater comes in, that will be, because it's a very important asset, and obviously it's an expensive asset as well for them, so that won't be damaged. But also we've moved the electrical all the sort of electricity points have been moved above the flood level water as well. So some really simple things that you can do if you do suffer a loss. And it's worth asking and speaking to your insurer about these, because lots of them are cash neutral as well. So just to pull out on a couple of unforeseen consequences. I've just had a minute warning, so I shall be quick here. So just to think about the unintended risks that you might also be bringing into your building if you do look at some more sustainable ways of managing your energy. So, for example, biomass boilers and PV systems both have some actual real downsides as well in terms of introducing increased fire risk and other risks into your property. Biomass boilers, for example, there is a sort of, they don't fully go out, so there is a sort of a thermal heat, residual thermal heat there with them as well. So particularly if your power cuts off, there can be a bit of an impact there. There has been spontaneous fermentation, and obviously with the pellets, and you're storing an awful lot of combustible material on site potentially as well. So just think about the unforeseen consequences and the other risks you might be introducing when you're trying to be more sustainable. PV systems as well. Sometimes the weight of them on the roof can be difficult, particularly if you've got snow and also more wind load as well. So actually you can have some real issues on your roof there too, as well as being a bigger challenge for the firefighters as well. If something does go wrong, they have to obviously be really careful about are they actually off, because particularly in bright daylight, you can't always tell. So you have to be really careful there too. So that can lead time, which we know time is money when it comes to fire, and certainly in the heritage sector, it can destroy our most precious assets. So just to summarize really quickly, so we are definitely, as an industry, seeing change in weather patterns. It is more severe and it is costing the industry more, but you can adapt, and there is resilient repairs that you can do as well. But just choose your methods very carefully, please, and move to the south. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Faith, very much indeed. So we've got lots of advice this evening about where we should go and live. And now it's over to you. We've got people with microphones around the room, and feel free to engage with the panel or with each other or whatever. Can I hog the first question? Because actually, Faith, if photovoltaics is not the answer, for the reasons which you just rather dramatically suggested, what do you do instead?
So not saying it's not the answer, I would say. If you can use it, but be careful about the supplier that you pick and the type of units you actually go for, because some do come with proper switch-offs and things that you can make sure are absolutely switched off as well, but they're not all the same. So you need to be careful when you're purchasing and making those decisions as well.
Okay. Right. So, we have two familiar faces. Ingrid, Samuel. Actually, it's probably helpful if you say who you are when you're asking a question as well, if you don't mind.
Hi, I'm Ingrid Samuel. I'm Historic Environment Director at the National Trust, and I'm also a Heritage Alliance trustee. And I guess the question I wanted to put to the panel, or wanted the panel to consider, was something about the change in conservation practice that we as a sector may or may not want to be thinking about in response to climate change. So there's something in my head about the attitude to change and how we need to be thinking potentially slightly differently about that. And I'll give a few examples. So we could be thinking about rewilding, but the impact that has on archaeology, the impact that has on our understanding of landscapes and landscape legibility. We could be thinking about all sorts of renewable technologies, but the impact that has on setting of our historic assets. We could be thinking about our historic buildings and the changes we need to make in order to help them to adapt. So time for us to be rethinking conservation practice, and as a sector, sort of finding that balance. And how do we find that balance between being forward-looking but also managing to carry forward into the future what we want to bring from the past?
Thank you. I'm not going to ask Keith that.
Why?
Because you're a colleague. You're a colleague. Yes, Hannah.
Yeah, so I agree. I think one of the examples that I'll give in a moment, I'll ask Keith to explain because I always use his example to illustrate this. But I think it's very closely connected to what it is that we value our heritage assets for. And I think there's a presentation that Meredith and I have both given where we include, and we didn't have time to include it today, but we include a discussion about what it is that we value about heritage and how that may change in the future. And I think it is not, these things are not static. So recognising that opens up some possibilities, I think. However, we also know from our colleagues working in cathedrals and churches that we have many buildings that have coped quite nicely with weather conditions for hundreds of years that are not coping currently. And my favourite example is Keith's example from Wales. And my favourite solution is this site because, well, you can tell them about it. You know what I'm talking about. Sneak you in there. But so it's learning from the past to then adapt to these future challenges in a way that is not necessarily conventional conservation practice. But
well, we've got a listed building in the heart of Snowdonia, in the shadow of Snowdon, and it's now experiencing weather it's not experienced before, because what we're now getting is wind-driven rain penetrating the fabric much deeper than it used to. So how do we adapt? The problem that it really highlighted, that the educational training and competency need for planning advisors really, that we need to adapt. So what we've done there is we've learned the vernacular in the area, so we've slate hung. Basically, we've built a roof on the gable end of it in order that it can deal with this wind-driven rain. So it's adaptation, but using an old approach on an old building, but in a new place. But my God, it was difficult. Not the doing, it was getting the permission to do. We repointed the building twice and we did all sorts of stuff. But that's the approach that I'd like us to look at, learning from the past. It's not a unique situation there. So everything in the West, we've got to really look at it.
Why was it so hard to get permission?
Because it's a listed building that was, and its listing was for its form and its shape and its features, and nowhere in the listing does it say a gable end draped with hanging slate.
David, do you want to come in on this one?
Yeah, I'd just like to make the point, because I think it's a really, really, really interesting sort of conversation, and we could have sort of, hours talk about this particular point, but I think I'd just like to sort of state that it's not just the heritage sector which is coming late to this conversation. As a society, we have reached it too late, and we need to get to net zero by 2050. That may sound like quite a long time away, but it's actually one career span, effectively. I myself will be 58 in 2050. It's not actually that far away. You'll still be around, though, Keith.
I said you were young earlier. What's gone wrong?
But it's just to say that actually, particularly the heritage sector, which has a very much appreciation of time for these things, we don't have long to get it right. But what we don't have time for is to get it wrong either. And I think that's key to get the right decisions. I'm so glad sort of what Faith was saying around sort of solar and things like this as well. We need to get the right decisions. We need to make the right ones. And the one I'll point to is the famous ones is the plastic space, where we had this knee-jerk reaction away from plastics in everything. Plastic straws being one example, and we sort of knee-jerk response into paper straws, which actually, from an environmental, holistic point of view, isn't very good. Obviously, the better solution is no straws at all, and we sort of got to that eventually. But this very, we need to do something response is very good, but we need to just take a breath, take a moment, rationalise, and get the right response, and that's particularly important for the heritage sector, I think.
Thank you. Do either of you from Historic England want to comment on the vexed issue of listing?
No.
Well, you heard it here. Okay. Right, well, let's move on.
We're not in that department.
Yeah, Tim, yes. What about, you must have to deal with listing consents and all that.
A lot. And it's and getting the balance right is a challenge. And it's, and I suppose you can see why lots of developers run for the hills with these buildings, because they've all heard scare stories that they can't. And they can't do what they intend to do with it. And the difficulty can be sometimes that you find that the different elements of regulation and the different aspirations of organisations can fight against each other sometimes. So it might be that we need to achieve a certain level of insulation for a residential, for a home. But of course that might mean that then we want to leave the brickwork exposed, but you have to be then clever about what other technology you use and what are the build-ups of materials you use elsewhere in the property to enable you to leave that brickwork exposed, but create a thermal model that allows you to do that, to satisfy the SAP calculations that you need to do in order to meet building regulations and so on. But then that in turn may conflict with some sort of disability access requirements and so on. So it's a bit of a minefield, and of course it's changing all the time. But the great thing is that because of new technologies that are constantly evolving, materials technology in particular, that's allowing us with increased freedom all the time to be able to come up with more innovative and creative solutions to solve the challenge. And I think that's the benefit of this kind of like us all being aware of the need to make a difference sooner rather than later, is that actually there's some brilliant brains working on some really clever stuff that is going to help us in the future.
Thank you very much indeed.
Sorry, having said I wouldn't talk about
Oh.
this thing.
Tempted around.
We're teasing
So
you
I
out.
caveat this with, I used to work in planning archaeology a long time ago, and I don't have to do that anymore. So I don't want to speak for colleagues who are dealing with these applications. But one thing that I do know that's come out of research that I know Ingrid's been involved with is that there is a perception that you can't do a long list of things to listed buildings. And it's simply not necessarily true. You can make a case to do pretty much anything, but it has to be a good case and it has to be reasoned, and it will be considered on the merits of that building and that circumstance. So I think maybe taking off my professional hat for a moment, maybe contemplate testing, challenging, thinking, are there good arguments? But the arguments have to be good and they have to be appropriate. And I think we are entering new territory in how we address these things. But don't assume that you won't be allowed to do things.
That sounds like progress to me.
I have one follow-up and just say I'd love people like Tim to think about how you work with the sector going forwards to help us get that right.
Yeah. Okay, right. Let's move to another question. I've got Crispin Truman from CPRE there, but the lady behind you has got the microphone. So you learn.
Caroline Kay from Bath Preservation Trust, just following on from that last point. I think one has to recognise that conservation officers have had a horrible time over the last decade or so. And one of the things, perhaps from Historic England or in participation with the whole of the sector, is to help them come to the conclusions about adaptation that we're all talking about here. And they've had jobs cut, they've had budgets cut and all the rest. And my perception is certainly in Bath and North East Somerset that the conservation officers perceive themselves as this sort of enclosed bastion, very frightened of everything that's coming at them from climate emergencies and all this sort of thing. And I think the more we can do to share good examples and get stuff out there, preferably from other conservation officers, why we said yes, the better, really, because you've really got to help these people come to the right answers, I think.
I think our colleagues have a long list of fantastic examples of where treating a building in a logical, common sense way would have been great and would have worked for the building and the people, and the conservation officer couldn't make that call because they weren't able to do that. If we could put that into practice, if we could put that into a list or some kind of document that would help, I think that would be a really useful thing.
Okay, Crispin Truman, sitting there, you've already put in a question on Twitter.
Do I have to ask that one?
No, you don't have to ask that one. Well, I won't mention it if you don't want me to.
No, you can do. I just wanted to ask about transport, because nobody ever mentions transport, though it's great to hear Tim talk about residential car-free developments. But as soon as you leave the city, what we see is the transport sector's the single biggest in this country contributor to climate change and the only growing sector now, and yet nobody's doing anything about it, including our sector and the landscape sector. So the recent Glover review of national parks found that 95% of visits to national parks are by car. The same is true of heritage sites outside the cities. So what can the managers and providers of landscape and heritage sites do to try and stop visitors coming by car?
Okay, just on the question before we go to the panel on that, I've got a note here that Roger King from the Federation, is he here? Roger King from the Federation of British Historic Vehicle Clubs is in the room. So would you like to add to the subject of transport, and then we'll see what these...
Yes, is this functioning? Yes, it is. Well, the mobile heritage sector, which takes in vehicles, railways, steam, marine, is moving away from being viewed as transport and is becoming an increasingly important element of Britain's cultural heritage. Mobile heritage brings a significant financial contribution to both national and local economies and provides skills training and employment, many of which are transferable to other areas of heritage. Of increasing importance, as with all heritage, is bringing proven benefits in well-being to both participants and the audience alike. A lot of people like the things the historic mobile heritage sector does. It must be understood that mobile heritage has a very low impact on environmental change. These vehicles are by their nature old and are not being replaced with new. They were built to be maintained, constructed of materials that are far less harmful to the environment than those used in their modern counterparts. They are not changed for new ones every 2 or 3 years. They're used very little, with a typical classic such as a Morris Minor having a significantly lower annual carbon footprint than the keeping of a small pet dog. With all this in mind, I would like to ask the panel where they see the future of mobile heritage with respect to heritage in Great Britain.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. I'm going to come to Tim again, because you spoke in your presentation about how you try not to provide parking space and so on. The issue of historic vehicles is perhaps slightly a different one, but if you want to talk about the current views about it.
Yeah, I think you can't just remove something, though, and then say tough. You've got to think about what else is going to go in their place as well. So we use car clubs, as you know, as we mentioned, free electric car charging, but also the decision to bring, we're near to canal areas quite a lot in the northwest of England, so we're able to access canal networks. So we bring those into the development, which means that people can then jog and cycle. So it's not so much for the narrow boats, but more for the access and the permeability and the reconnection of the city. One of the developments I didn't get a chance to show you either was where we're taking a collection of buildings in the city centre location, and we're kind of like reconnecting the city by opening them up again, because they were kind of closed. It was a former university campus and it was all closed off. So a simple thing like that, actually, to make our towns and our cities easier to get across does make a huge difference, especially when people, which means that people can get to a train station more easily, or they can pick up. We provide cycle storage. That's really important, so various kind of like car clubs, scooter clubs where we have communal scooter racks where people can plug and unplug and play. Things like that make a big difference. I mean, what you do about historic buildings is a different challenge. I don't think retrofitting them with electric engines is going to go down too well, although I know that the automotive industry are having some success with that in terms of classic vehicles. I've seen some fantastic examples of Aston Martins and Porsche 911s. But doing that with a locomotive sounds like mission impossible.
Thanks. David, I mean, what's your view about the historic vehicles situation? I mean, they do have a problem, don't they?
We do have a problem, and I think it'll be really interesting to see which cars actually make it into the historic category, because, we are going to see petrol and diesel cars within the next sort of decade or two become completely obsolescent. So it'll be so interesting to see which sort of stay and which ones don't. I'm not sure my Vauxhall Zafira, which I used to drive to McDonald's when I passed when I was 17, will make it into that exclusive club. I think that's one best to be forgotten. I think... And this comes back to sort of definitions, because obviously I see the place for fossil fuels being used by those heritage vehicles as part of that mobility sector, but it does very much define sort of, as Keith was saying, well, how do you define sort of net zero? Because if that is the case, and if heritage as a sector wants to be net zero compatible, you need to balance that somewhere else.
Well, presumably...
There needs to be some sort of offsetting if you are burning that.
Well, presumably you'll still have to keep mining coal in order to fuel a locomotive, for example. Yeah. Tricky one. Faith, do you have a view on this one?
I think, because I'm afraid to say, yes, we don't do motor insurance, so that's one way of solving the issue.
Very good. Sorry, you need a... Sorry. Can you wait until you get the microphone, please?
Well, while we're waiting, I think the thing about these kinds of questions is that this connects to intangible heritage, right? It's not just a car. It's part of a whole lifestyle that people are looking at, that they're remembering, or they have an idea in their head of what it was. It's not just the car or the locomotive. It's their intangible heritage that they're connecting to. And you can look at that as being carbon neutral, or you can look at that as being part of a bigger issue. But that heritage, that idea, and that culture will be around after the locomotive is gone. So take that.
And so I know Hannah and Keith also want to come in. Hannah.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to draw some parallels with work that colleagues of ours have been doing on the sort of post-carbon age, and looking back at coal-fired power stations and various industrial heritage. and looking at our industrial heritage strategy, recognising that as we move into a carbon neutral era, there are significant connections and community connections, very meaningful ones, that I think it's really important we don't lose sight of. And this is part of our history and our human story. And we can learn from that, just as we had the Industrial Revolution, and these are a part of that journey of development. We are now moving into a post-carbon revolution. And I think it's important that we do retain that heritage and that we do think about the innovation that went into developing that technology, because it's that ability to innovate that will help us through the next phase.
Very good point.
Right, I won't answer the historical vehicle one because I'm a recovering petrol head, so having spent many years rallying and all sorts of stuff. So I'm worse because I'm converted. But the sustainable transport one is a huge challenge, especially for rural areas on it. We recently submitted evidence to the Sustainable Tourism ask from one of the committees, and just before everything else blew up in Parliament in terms of debate and stuff. But we flagged up that, yes, we have peaks of excellence, but the rest of the iceberg, which is all the other hundreds of millions of travelling that's happening, we cannot just build more car parks. We can't build our way out of this. And then one of the quite senior people on finance asked us, are we backing the right horse with this in terms of we're doing the car parks up? I said, look, until the indicators of change come from government, until you see billions of pounds going into public transport, going into infrastructure, we can only do the best that we can do. So we're putting EV charger points in, we're helping with examples on public transport in specific areas, but it really is scratching at the surface. It's a huge problem across the UK on it. 8 million more people by 2050 in the UK. At the moment, we haven't got public transport infrastructure that can take them, so it's going to go by car. We know that the car will decarbonise because of the way the industry is going, the way the world is going. But you're still talking of an awful lot of embedded carbon in an awful lot of cars, and we're not building more car parks and we're not doing all sorts of stuff. So we've identified it in our work stream as one of the elephants in the room in terms of advocacy. Government need help. They need to know, they need to see good examples. They need challenge on it, but they also need support.
Just very quickly on that one, I think that's a very good point, but I think, don't let the sort of, the elephant in the room sort of, this is a massive challenge for everyone, get in the way of what you can do now, because obviously, as you rightly point out, EV charges is such a sort of quick win, and that is becoming very much sort of expected by a lot of people now, very much how free Wi-Fi in cafes and restaurants has just become sort of accepted as the norm. More and more people will be looking for these services. And the other one, which is an extremely sort of very good sort of quick win, is making any vehicles which you do have in your control, any sort of fleet vehicle which service estates electric. So two very good quick wins there which are in your control and you can do now, which would have an impact.
Okay, thank you. Now, there's a gentleman at the back who's got the microphone.
Just picking up on what I was saying before, although I'm not actually with the Heritage Railway Group, I'm with the Association of British Transport and Engineering Museums, so we kind of take an overview of all the museums. I was just wanting really to say how small and how tiny really the amount of coal that is really burnt by Heritage Railways. We've just been going through some research into this. Heritage Railways actually do burn something like 25,000 tonnes of coal, which is an enormous amount, it sounds to most of us. But in comparison with the nearly 300 million that we used to mine in this country and burn in this country, it's minute. And in actual fact, it's less than 0.07, I think it is, percent of the total carbon emissions in the country. So you're right, the big problem is clearly road transport and all the lorries and things that are going up and down the roads and the cars that we all use every day. And that's a big challenge, clearly, for every heritage organisation that isn't in a town, really.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Noted, it's minute. Let's move on to something which isn't, which we've had a text message, I think, from Hannah Shimko, who incidentally was responsible for putting together the Heritage Alliance's recent report on the creative industries and heritage, which I very strongly commend to you. It's an innovative piece of work. And anyway, Hannah has come into the meeting and she says, what are good examples of engaging audience visitors with the changes necessary? How do we deal with resistance to change from long-term supporters? Assuming that long-term supporters are resistant, I suppose. David?
Listen, I mean, this is very much sort of my space as a climate change communicator, and the TED talk you sort of mentioned why I don't care about climate change was sort of looking at exactly this. You know, why can you convince someone when climate change is an issue, but then really struggle to get them to do something? And what I came to sort of conclude in that is you really need to show them how what they care about will be affected by climate change, first of all, to make it as personal as possible. And actually talking around some of the climate impacts, we talked around how affecting it will affect our cultural landscape, I think is a very, very good point, and actually telling that story. And then the second thing is, how do you get them to do what you want them to do? And that action you need to get them to do is very specific by who they are. Some people, for example, might be very resistant to eating less meat. Some people, on the other hand, mightn't be. Some people might sort of be in the position and be able to switch from a petrol and diesel car to an electric car. Some people might be more resistant to that one. So I think the more information you have on your membership base, the better, and the more you can design the campaign or whatever it be to do that target community, rather than doing something across the full sort of portfolio, particularly something like the National Trust, for example. The nationwide campaigns are good for raising awareness and engagement, but less about turning that engagement into action. We're now at a very, very sort of powerful time where so many people are primed to do something, and they don't really know what that something is.
Thank you. I mean, Faith, do you have a view, when you have a business which interfaces with the public every day, how do you go about convincing people of the importance of all of this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think David was really right to touch on the point that it's got to be totally audience specific, but it's also got to be something that people really believe and can do. And the advice we always try and give around how you might adapt your buildings or your world is very practical, pragmatic, but also thinking about the other competing priorities that people have. So heritage sector, we know, has a lot of challenges around funding, and the same as the church sector, and funding and money. So trying to make them quite cost-effective solutions, I think, are really, really important as well. And also, allowing and providing ideas of where you might go to speak to people that can provide cost-effective, good solutions as well for adaptation resilience. Again, is the sort of approach that we would take to that scenario.
Thank you.
I think one of the things, I think we understand as a business thing, we do understand human behaviour really well. I think that's why we've grown so quickly. And I think that we are lazy people are lazy, but at the same time we don't really want to make things worse for ourselves and the planet, generally speaking. So what we find works best for us is to make it really easy for people to take part in things that are going to help contribute toward the whole. So it could be, providing lots of options around how they can recycle, be it a resident as a business or as an individual. That's really important, to make it so simple for them to do and not an additional effort. It's an additional effort. People just will not do it. So you've got to make their life easier. But also explain to them, if we have a beekeeping class on one of our buildings, then you can start to join the dots to them and explain to them, and we give them the honey, which is really nice honey, and they get that, and you can communicate to them as you do that, which is, look, there's a reason why this is part of a bigger ecosystem which we have to protect and we have to nurture it, and if you do that for us, if you enjoy that honey and think, and at the same time think about the impact that you're going to have on recycling, we give people, we don't have to do this anymore actually, but at the start, to encourage people to use our electric car charging bays, we had to give them we have cafe bars and restaurants in our ground floor workspaces. We have to give them a coffee and a croissant to make them use the electric car charging bay. But little things like that, little nudges along the way, you can change human behaviour. And then the big thing is that everybody likes when they see other people doing it and they see it's easy, people kind of just generally will fall into line and copy and replicate. So that's what we found.
I so agree. I think people really do want to do the right thing, but it's got to be made simple. And recycling is an absolutely classic example. I'm not supposed to have an opinion tonight, am I? But it's an absolutely classic example of how it's too complicated and people don't understand it in many different boroughs. And why is it all a different system in different boroughs anyway? Sorry. Hannah, did you want to go?
Yeah, please. I thoroughly recommend everyone take a look at the work of an organisation called Climate Outreach. They have produced one of my favourite documents that I always try and raise at every climate change discussion, called the Uncertainty Handbook, which is about 14 pages long and has a brilliant example of the different ways that you can communicate to different audiences. And they've also looked at the role that the historic environment can play in helping to engage those harder-to-reach audiences, I think, which is what your question was addressing. And one of the things they discovered, I think they did a piece of work with, I think it was with Getty, but anyway, someone produced it about imaging and around imaging, and they said that one of the most off-putting images is of the stereotyped, what was it David Cameron called the Extinction Rebellion protesters? But anyway, the crusties in the square. Was it not? Anyway, wasn't it? Anyway, whoever was describing them. But the stereo. Oh yeah, of course. Wake up. Anyway, but the stereotypes of the crusty environmentalists waving their placards and chaining themselves to trees is really off-putting for an awful lot of people that you want to get on board. And what Climate Outreach discovered was actually if you start to normalise some of the solutions, so images that show a normal family picnic that just happened to have a wind turbine in the background, or and that heritage actually making those connections and trying to seek those opportunities to normalise some of these solutions alongside those things that are more traditional and more familiar can be really powerful. So yeah, take a look at their work. It's very
good. Thanks. Let's take another question from the floor. There's a gentleman there waving the microphone.
I've got it. My name's Don Gobbett, and I'm a board member of World Heritage UK. One of the things we're beginning to think about is transport and visitor numbers. Many of our sites rely heavily on large numbers of visitors for their income, but one of the scenarios with more sustainable transport is simply we don't travel so much. So has anybody thought about and done research or had any thoughts on how finance will be, if you like, the gap will be plugged if there are fewer visitors?
Thank you. Keith, you and I were chatting about this before the meeting, so do you want to have a first crack at that one?
The assumption of less visitors is, I'm not sure where that comes from. The ranges of vehicles are getting longer, more people want to go further. I'm not sure where the less visitors come from. We're struggling in some of our World Heritage sites with too many people on site. So we're doing a full carrying capacity look at Giant's Causeway at the moment, well over 1 million visitors to site. And we're looking at are the visitors actually degrading the site with the footfall and everything else that's happening on there. The financing of World Heritage sites, I think it depends on the site quite often, because it depends on their business model. Where I know there's quite a bit of work happening on the vulnerability of World Heritage sites at the moment, in terms of there's a perception of vulnerability to climate change aspects on it. But until you get under the bonnet properly of a site and understand what's it vulnerable to, right? Less rainfall. What does that actually mean to the site? The transport thing that you flagged up, I'm not sure will be borne out. People don't want less of anything. If they're used to a certain amount of travel, you cannot tell them to travel less. They will fight back on you. On the communication side, going back to the question you were asking earlier, we've just done a huge piece of survey work looking with our members and our volunteers and the UK general population. What are the 10 things that keep you awake at night? And luckily, 97% said that climate change was number 1 or number 2. Brexit was actually quite low on it, which I was quite surprised with, if you read the papers on it.
That's because they've gone to sleep.
So we then asked them, do you want to do something about it? And a very high percentage want to do something about it. So the World Heritage sites are the creme de la creme of sites. People will still go there. I'm not sure where this perception of less travel comes from at the moment.
Meredith, do you have a thought about this one?
My thought really sort of centres around the Climate Vulnerability Index for World Heritage that Keith mentioned. This is a new product that's recently been published, and I encourage that you all have a look at it. What makes it really groundbreaking is that it looks at community resilience as part of that risk analysis. It doesn't just look at more rain, flooding. It looks at the people who are around that site. Are they resilient? Is their community resilient? Are the businesses resilient? And that's really important. I think it makes it a really, like a truly groundbreaking approach to looking at these sites. And what they're hoping, that the creators are hoping, is that they can look at World Heritage first and then take it and make it sort of simple enough for everybody to use for their sites as they want to.
Thank you. Let's take another question.
Yep.
Oh, you've got a microphone.
I've got a microphone.
These people keep popping up with microphones.
Who else has got a microphone? Judith Martin, I'm a trustee of the Heritage Trust Network. I might be about to tread on a few toes, so I shall be very polite and flattering first and say how thrilled I am that you haven't felt obliged to have a climate change denier on the panel. I mean, statistically, you probably ought to have Nigel Lawson's little finger on a plinth or something, but they are still around. I was at the National Trust AGM a few days ago, and there were a couple there talking. We were supposed to be discussing environmental change, climate change. I wasn't really going to mention wind power, but somebody has. So quite a lot of bodies in this room represent, statutory bodies. You know, they get consulted, and even if they're not statutory, they still have opinions. And the sort of, to me, it's illogical. It's a sort of shibboleth of belief about wind power. Some people really, really hate wind turbines. I actually think they're rather lovely. And if they're properly done and intelligently cited so that they work, it's obviously no good putting them somewhere where they aren't going to be successful. I would like all the organisations that we belong to stop blocking applications. And the National Trust used to have a real zealot of a chairman who was opposed to them, but that is no longer the case. So, I mean, even just as members individually in this room of these organisations, can we stop blocking them? And can we, if some of us represent organisations as serious landowners, can we think about solar farms, for instance, on poor agricultural land or redundant land and that sort of thing? The Historic Houses Association, I know some people have put in phenomenal estate-based biomass systems, but if it's not estate-based, if you're bringing the stuff in from God knows where, you know, some of it's imported from America, that's nonsense. There need to be individual, local, sustainable solutions on a site-by-site or even building-by-building basis. But where you have a lot of clout, can we please really support the big societal changes? And I would start with wind power.
Thank you very much indeed. Let's not get drawn into a conversation about climate change denying, but let's go to Keith, the National Trust and wind turbines, for example.
You've got two Keiths. You've got two Keiths on the stage here. Keith, the director of community energy companies that's built quite large wind turbines and quite large hydros and quite large PV and a lot of other stuff. That things that the democratization of it is where we should be going on it. The local ownership, the local benefit of it. The National Trust is currently looking at where do we go next. By the end of next year, we'll be generating 50% of our energy need from the estate. We're now looking at how do we pass 100% from the estate. Plans are in place. We'll be hitting 50% by about March 2021. But it's taken us about 8 years to get up to speed, basically, to get the expertise, to get the experience, to get the funding right, to get the site location right. So we're quite a good client now for developers, but we are also sharing. The community energy projects, basically, they've enabled, because we've shared what we learned with them. They just happen to be within 10 miles of my house, but that's beside the point on there. So the sharing is the most important bit, and the ownership is as important, the stakeholders in there. I think the Renewable Energy Network in the UK is saying that over 75 or 78% of people really like wind turbines. It's the noisy few that don't on it. That's part of the problem. We couldn't get a 3% climate denier in on the stage on it, because that's the return we've had from the survey. Only 3% don't actually agree it's happening, but they're bloody noisy.
Yeah, they are. David?
I've had many arguments with Nigel Lawson in my time.
So have I. It's never been worthwhile.
No, but yeah, thank you very much for making the point. I think it's a very, very good one, and I do think we, as a collective, need to sort of hold people to account when they have those sort of drunk uncle moments and sort of forget the the emergency which we are in. Interestingly, I do think the spectrum of denial has very much shifted. I meet very few people who sort of deny the science anymore, but sort of argue for sort of delayed transition, which is interesting, and I think we need to sort of tackle those arguments in very, very different ways to what we previously had. But in terms of sort of onshore wind, I completely agree with you as well. It is by far the cheapest form of renewable energy we have in the country. It's extremely cost effective, and it will only become more so in the coming years. But I share the point which Keith was saying. I'm very much a fan of sort of community energy as well. I do think that if you have what some people would see as the burden of the wind turbine infrastructure, I myself love wind turbines as well. I think they're very, very nice. But I think if you do have that in your community, you should have the sort of reap the rewards effectively in the form of sort of having that renewable energy for you rather than just the grid. But I do think it's a fantastic opportunity for people like the National Trust to form sort of, new relationships with communities as well. The National Trust is sort of energy providers would build such a powerful new relationship with communities.
We've built the first UK end-to-end energy supply network for a community cooperative. The hydro that the Trust own is actually supplying the town directly, and the members in the town are saving between 20 to 30% on their electricity bill.
Where's that?
Bethesda in North Wales. We got a session on Moneybox Live and all sorts of other things, but we're making more money. They're saving money. So it's a win-win situation.
Yeah. Hannah.
There's one question that I always ask people in that context, and that's when you're facing the reality of climate change and the impact it's having on our monuments and our buildings and on our heritage assets, and you're saying, "Oh, this is terrible, and I really think we should do something about it." And on the other hand, you might be using those as a reason not to do something about it. And how do people feel in that particular... there are always site-based challenges, etc. But I think if you actually stop to reflect on those, the tension inherent in our sector when it comes to those sorts of decisions, that can often help. And I also had personal experience in my days as a planning archaeologist. I remember a particular application for wind turbines on somewhere called Windmill Hill. And I remember thinking, in the end, I think it was refused. It may have been close to a national park that will remain nameless. But I was very frustrated with the applicant for not actually making that part of the discussion. And that actually there was, in my mind, there could have been an argument that was an entirely appropriate use of that site, given its history.
Right.
Can I just add one more thing to that? I know we've been talking about this a while, but I've got 2 young children, and for them, the windmills are just going to be part of the landscape, and it's their history, it's their heritage. So you can talk to older people or whoever is against windmills, these loud dissenters, and the one way I've been able to get through to them is to say, for my kids, they're just part of the landscape, and they go, "Oh, that's really interesting." And you're like, "How did you not think of this?" It's just going to be there for the children. So, I think as long as we can just keep it going
If I may, I had a conversation not very long ago with somebody about Didcot Power Station. And everyone here will know that you come over the Chilterns and basically there's a long view, and wherever you go, within about 50 miles, there is Didcot Power Station, gradually coming down and ceasing to be such a blot. And this person was saying, "Oh, God, I can't stand wind turbines all over the countryside." And I said, "Well, what about Didcot Power Station?" They said, "Oh, but we need that." It says it all. Right, let's have another question.
I'd just like to thank all the speakers so much for their contributions. I'm Scott Eleanor. I'm a lecturer based in UCL in the Institute for Sustainable Heritage. I don't want to stand, sorry, I'm going to stay sitting. I think it was really interesting how each of the panellists included some aspect of the changes in exposure due to changes in the climate and the change in impact. And I guess what I'd be really interested to hear about is how do we go from impact and exposure to actually being able to analyse risk And so what do we not know yet about the risk to heritage and to resilience, both of built and natural and societal impacts and risk and resilience?
Okay, thank you. Faith?
Gosh, we don't know what we don't know, do we? That's a really difficult question to answer. I think what we're finding, though, is actually there's more use of technology and data as well now than ever before. And things like our building management systems, so things like IoT, use of IoT now, and sensor technology is allowing us to build more data points than we've ever had before in terms of how a building responds to the climate and the risks and the efficiency of that building as well. And we've just got a project at the moment with English Heritage at Kenwood House, which is a really challenging property for them for a number of different reasons. But there's a lot being learnt there in those sorts of projects, collaborative projects between tech companies, the heritage world, and the insurance company as well. So we're working in partnership to try and analyse and learn more, because we recognise we don't know everything at the moment. There is still so many unknowns, and particularly around the weather and the weather patterns. I mean, it's even now in today's world, we don't really know. Probably it's only within 24 hours. We don't really have an accurate forecast, do we? But there are more and more companies now that are doing work on that and are actually piecing together all the data, so all the meteorology data, all the weather data out there, and can do things like show you the direction now, where if a flood is coming, the direction the water would actually hit you from. So companies like Balkern are doing that sort of work. And that hopefully will enable us in the longer term to get to more of a proactive management of the climate and the building or the landscape, whatever it is we're looking to protect from that climate change. I think there is more and more technology and more companies focused on this now that can help us to learn what we don't know and give us more data points and bring that together in this world of AI and new technology. I think that's what this technology revolution will hopefully give us.
And thank you. And Tim, you've got a property in Sheffield, for example, which is a place that floods quite often. Yeah. You presumably have an approach to the whole question of climate change-related risk.
I suppose I'm certainly no expert on that particular point. So, and we kind of we often work on the basis of which is it's been there 100 years. It's going to be there for a lot longer, I suppose. But actually, you can't assume that anymore, of course, because of the way things are changing. What a mistake I see a lot in the development world is that we have this thing which is 1 in 100-year risk sort of thing. It's fine, but that won't affect us. But yet, there are sites that we're aware of where developers are building things on them where it might have occurred 2 or 3 times in the past 10 years, and yet it's deemed to be a 1 in 100-year risk. And you can develop them, but the way that they're being developed is no different to how you develop a standard house, which is frightening. And I can't quite understand how they can get away with it. So there's still a long way to go on that. And when you add on to that the unknowns, it's a scary prospect.
Indeed. Keith?
It's my area of work at the moment, which is the vulnerability assessment of everything. Right, where do you start? We've got 28,000 buildings, 250,000 archaeological points, gardens, castles, habitats, all sorts of stuff. So what we're doing at the moment is, what do we know? Is that good enough to allow us to make an informed decision? So we're testing something called a threshold management tool. If we get the clever people to tell us what the threshold of this thing, whatever aspect we're talking about, can live with, and then when it exceeds, we can already have the management decision process in place, so we're not having to react all the time. I've got a chat tomorrow looking at the new ISO 14090, the new climate change adaptation ISO. Nobody's really got it yet. It was out about 2 months ago. Is it a framework that we can use when you've got such a huge portfolio of things of it? The adaptation, what we do with it, that's a completely different question. At the moment, it's what is vulnerable, what's it vulnerable to? And to me, also, if we get rid of 2/3 of the things that aren't vulnerable, it clears the way in order that we can then focus in on the bits that are vulnerable based on the data that we already have. Because you'll never have enough data. Talk to an academic, it's okay for now, but you need another academic in to get more data in on something or other. Best is the enemy of good enough.
I think just quickly if you're looking at people who are really looking into this, I would actually point to the insurance sector, because I was talking to the insurance sector up in Edinburgh about 2 weeks ago, and they are doing a lot of work in this. They are very rightly sort of so concerned around the increasing impact of climate change. And what fascinates me is attribution of damage because of climate change, which is very, very hard to do. I'm sure Faith will agree with me on this one. What damage was caused as a result of climate change, and there are more and more studies coming out now of attribution to say because of that observable increase in sea level, losses because of that storm were 30% higher and things like that, and we will see more than that.
Just ask a question of Faith, because I've been dealing with our insurers and they keep talking about the market hardening on things, be it on wildfires or flooding or whatever. What aspects do you see the market harden to, as in difficult to get insurance for, or it's more expensive?
I'm not going to make myself popular by saying this, but actually listed buildings at the moment is definitely, we are seeing what we would call in the market capacity shrinking for that type of property insurance. The reasons being Notre Dame, Glasgow School of Art, Clarendon Park, I could go on.
There's only one of us.
Right, yeah. Lots and lots of change in that sector, but also windstorm. So again, the increasing weather patterns, the freeze, also the subsidence as well. There are so many different things at play at the moment that are all forcing capacity back, but it becomes more complicated in the heritage sector, and it's more difficult to find capacity there because listed buildings take a lot more, skills, expertise, time to repair and reinstate to the right quality again. So definitely we are seeing a market hardening, particularly in the heritage sector, which is probably why you've heard that message. But also reinsurers, as you're probably aware, insurers reinsure. And again, just globally, whatever's happening globally, and that's climate change globally, the hurricanes that you've seen in the US, the cost of those, everything increasing has a huge impact then on the cost of that reinsurance for the UK market as well. And it all, unfortunately, trickles down to yourselves sitting there as buying your insurance.
But you're still open for business, I
Absolutely. Ecclesiastical have been over 130 years in the heritage sector, and we're not going anywhere, that's for sure. Absolutely. But yeah.
Shall we take another question? There are two. It's heading towards you.
Hello, it's Catherine Ross from the Church of England. I wanted to ask the panel for their observations on heating our heritage buildings. Very conscious that for us to heat our buildings in a net zero way, we have to stop burning gas and oil. But we also need to protect our historic interiors, and we also need it to be affordable. And how do we try and square that circle?
Thank you. Hannah?
That's a very good question. So when you say heating, I immediately think of some conversations that we're having at the moment with colleagues working on energy efficiency and perceptions of comfort versus the reality of heating spaces, which is answering a slightly different question than the one that you asked, but I think is something that is relevant to a lot of the conversations that relate to traditional buildings. So we have colleagues who are actually putting together a workshop for Thursday, I think, starting to look at this. So we're obsessed with what temperatures say on thermometers and air temperature, rather than necessarily personal comfort. And there's one brilliant example that actually I think it was your predecessor, Catherine, who might have given me this example, of a church where they'd invested lots in their heating, and they were saying, well, this isn't really working. Why are we still feeling cold? And someone changed the light bulb to being a reddish colour or put some covering over the heater so it exuded a red light, and everyone said, oh my goodness, this is marvellous, it's so much better. And I think there's an awful lot about psychology of how we feel comfort. We could go into this in detail, but it's something that building conservation colleagues in Historic England are certainly looking into with regard to how we adapt buildings to do that better. I think National Trust are probably better able to answer questions about collections and interior management through heating.
Yeah. It's over to you.
I've had this question from so many people that manage churches. Basically, quite often, why would you, in your right mind, put £50,000 into a heating system that some buildings are only used 3 hours a week on it? So basically, I just said, look, use the building more, change some of the use, then come back and have this conversation. Because at the moment, your fossil fuel heating system is hardly ever on. So that's carbon neutral. You can have an oil boiler that's carbon neutral, just switch it off. But the contents is another question, and we're picking up quite a lot of research. There's a person called Nigel Blades in the National Trust, the Conservation Preventative Officer or Advisor, and he's seeing big shifts, especially in the southeast, where we've now got sites that are exceeding the set points for relative humidity. And these sites have got new heating systems and new control systems. Because as the temperature increases, the humidity also increases. I think in 10 mansions now in the southeast, it's exceeding what we can do to the sites on it. So he's now researching conservation ventilation, not air conditioning at all. It's the movement of air rather than the cooling of air. But this is, to me, this is a new science. This is a new look, because these buildings and their interiors have been built for a different climate. They're now experiencing things. But he also pointed out that quite often you can have old sites that have had damp interiors for 400 years. How do these now transition to a different temperature? So it's an area of work, should we say.
It so happens that we have in our midst the Chief Executive of the Church's Conservation Trust, Peter Ayres. If you could put your hand up, and I think it might be interesting to hear your views on this particular subject.
Thank you. I think, we own a collection of 353, soon to be 356 historic churches across England, the most sustainable ones of which are the ones in the middle of the field, which nobody visits except by foot. They have no heating and no lighting inside them. There's a deep irony in the funding associated comes with how popular these buildings are, and the least popular ones are probably the most sustainable. And to get people to love them, they have to visit them and belong to them. On the question of heating, though, we've done a lot of really quite large projects in relation to buildings to repurpose those, mostly, exclusively in urban areas, about how do you deal with buildings. And we've had several different solutions to these, and I would say that none of them is perfect in any way. Certainly, we've had underfloor heating in Ipswich, which is solving a Victorian problem anyway, which is probably the most successful once we sorted out the drafts in the building as well. In King's Lynn, we've used radiant heaters to heat the audience to a certain extent, and offset by having, I'm really worried, we've actually got PV cells on the roof, which is rather big now. But that was a Grade 1 building. And then elsewhere, we've been looking at these, how else can you do this? But the problem is, as well, introducing heating to these buildings is that you suddenly raise the cost of the cost of running the building in the first place. And in some ways, my thoughts are coming round to the most sustainable ways is actually working with the building to work out how often you can use it and what you can use it for. Some of the best examples are at Christmas when our churches are full of people singing carols. There's two things that really work. One is mulled wine, and the other is cushions and blankets, actually. And people supply those. And in some ways, for our collection of buildings, it's working with the building rather than adapting the building to what you would actually have. And events can be extremely successful because it's different from being at home. And why make it like it being at home?
That's a very good wider message. We've got a little bit more time, and we've got 3 hands up at the moment. And there's a question I want to ask that has come in at the end. So, yes, gentleman there.
Hi, Magnus Copps from Museum of London Archaeology. I was just thinking about Meredith's point that her children will see wind turbines as an accepted fact of the landscape in the future. And in a similar vein, if you talk to my dad, he gets quite excited about the march of high-energy pylons and motorways across the English landscape in the 50s and 60s. And I was just wondering what the panel make of the idea that there might be a lesson for future generations in our carbon-based infrastructure that we as heritage people need to think about preserving in some way or conserving, just as a sort of provocation.
David?
I think it's a very good point. I think it comes back to what sort of was said here earlier. You know, we are moving out of this high carbon age, which is a fascinating sort of chapter of humanity as we move into something else. And I do think there is a very valid, case there to preserve some of its cultural heritage. I mean, I come from the northeast of England, which sort of had a very, dramatic energy transition in the late 80s away from coal, and a lot of that heritage is very much still there for better or worse. But I do think there is a very valid case for looking at preserving some of the high carbon heritage, but also thinking forward and actually, thinking what will sort of define our age, what will define this next age of humanity. Is it the wind turbine? Will that become sort of the emblem of this new chapter of humanity? Will it be solar? Will it be something else? But I think it's a very valid point.
Keith?
I did a heritage lottery project a few years ago looking at our... because I'm a bit of a hydro nut, I'm afraid, so I'm not allowed to talk about it at home. But looking at the hydro heritage, which goes back right to the beginning, and there's these little treasure houses all over the countryside from middle to the end of the 19th century, and they're all going, they're all disappearing, they're just being left there. The company Lucas developed the first electrical-based wind turbine called the Lucas Freewind in 1919. I think there are a couple of them around. So it's not just the high carbon thing. Actually, we've got a long heritage of renewable energy systems as well. It wasn't called renewable energy then, it was just called energy in it. So our energy is transitioning now, probably quicker than something like the 1820s, probably the nearest we could draw paradox. It's a paradox at the moment that in Wales, 96% of the world's energy, or South Wales steam coal, as it was called, was exported through the Cardiff docks on it. So it's being celebrated as heritage on it. I think we should also be looking at the beginnings of the renewables as well as heritage.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Let's try to fit in another two questions. Oh, you're waving the wand. That puts you in a very powerful place.
Yeah, thank you. Sam B, Heritage Rail Association. There are two sources of heating which don't seem to find favour very much. I'd like your view on it. One is heat pumps, air source and ground source, and the other one is geo.
That is an observation. Do you wish to comment on if that is the case, why? Quickly.
I project managed the largest marine source heat pump in the UK when it went into Parsonage with an Anglesey 6 years ago. We put in hundreds of heat pumps. There is a problem with them because of the global warming potential of the hydrofluorocarbon that's in it. It's 5,000 times more global warming than actually carbon dioxide is. So we know we're transitioning to a different gas refrigerant for them. But if the future is electric, the future is heat pump as well.
Thank you very much. And then there's a lady at the...
Can I just do, while we're waiting for the next one, there's a really interesting case study of a retrofit in Gainsborough. And they retrofitted 3 or 4 buildings, they put heat pumps in, and then they followed people's energy use. And 2 of those buildings they couldn't use because they turned their heat pumps off because they were too noisy. So behavior change is really important as well. We can't just say, we'll just make everything heat pumps and it'll be fine. Because if people aren't using them, then there's no point.
It's not going to work. So, yes.
Hi, Julie Godefroy, sustainability consultant and engineer. I want to go back to heating and comfort. And I think we need to be really careful and differentiate uses such as churches and mansions where, yes, there are great things we can do about expectations of comfort. But when we talk about housing, I'm afraid this is really one area where the heritage sector has a lot to do to help reach net zero. And there are hundreds of thousands of households, very often in historic stock, in fuel poverty, in homes at cold, lower than average temperatures, with clear links to health outcomes. And I really think it's a very dangerous discourse to always make the link with comfort, expectations, and woolly jumpers. The reality is that we have to reduce demand. And it's not only about annual energy use. We can't just rely on electrification. there will just not be enough power stations or wind turbines.
Thank you very much. I did mention leaky small houses right at the beginning of this event. Historic England, what have you got a view on that?
Yes, absolutely. There have been projects. I think I can't recall what it's called, but there's a project that we were involved with looking at the maintenance of ordinary buildings. So this is one of the important points that I think is often missed. I think it's about a fifth of our homes are pre-1919 construction, and these are ordinary people's homes. And I think it's very easy to get distracted by those that are designated and what that might mean and the jewels in the crown. But actually, an awful lot of us, and I'm one of them, live in older properties, traditionally constructed properties. There are a number of things with this that I think often get conflated. One is absolutely there are people who are living in properties that are poorly maintained, that have very antiquated, often heating systems, and may not even have heating at all. And a lot of those people who are living in rental properties have very little control over what actually is providing that heating. I think absolutely we have to address that. There is also there are misconceptions around what traditional building materials mean, what traditional buildings need in terms of their maintenance. And I think often those two get conflated. So one of the things that we've been working on, particularly in flood risk areas, is the real importance of maintaining those traditional materials in those buildings because it makes them more resilient and better able to recover. And we've got extensive research on thermal efficiency and appropriate adaptations of those. And I think we do need to work harder at looking at how we can get that information to those communities that really actually need it and need that support, and working with that sector of undesignated heritage assets. But this project, I think, was about maintenance, and it did start to make connections with fuel poverty and with those people who are less able to adapt to some of those changes.
Tim, quickly, if you will.
Yeah, I think actually the two questions are linked as well. The previous question links to it because there's lots of smaller, older properties where people live in fuel poverty, and there's a capex issue there as to how they can afford to benefit from this modern technology. It's okay for us; we're fundamentally redeveloping buildings, and we can afford to do that. But also, we're building 300,000 homes a year, new homes, and they're also not energy efficient at all. So it's staggering. In fact, the rate in which we're building new places and new properties are in no way energy efficient. And actually, we're going to have to go back at some point and try and sort all that mess out. And the reason why I think that ground source heat pumps and air source heat pumps fundamentally aren't as popular. We use them a lot in our buildings, but that's because we retain ownership and we're the custodian and therefore get the long-term benefit of them. And at the minute, there's a massive disconnect between who actually creates the buildings and then who actually has to pay for them in the future. And until that's resolved, I think that situation is going to just persist.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I think we're very nearly at the end. I just got the final question I'd like to report to you. It's from Paul Jeffrey. Doesn't say where he's from, but he's asked on Twitter, what is the carbon footprint of this event, including the travel of those attending, food and drink? And he says, given the subject matter, could this event not have been organised as a webinar? Now, I'm going to ask the audience, would you rather have had this event organised as a webinar, or do you think it's been quite worthwhile having the companionship and the interchange of real human beings? It's not a biased question. It's a genuine inquiry after truth. So hands up anyone who would prefer to have had a webinar? 2, 3, 4. Right, we'll stop that process immediately. I hope very much you've enjoyed this. I know that there are far more questions that people would like to ask, but we are out of time. I think it's been very stimulating. The object of the exercise was to get people just thinking about it and talking about it and meeting each other, rather than sitting in our bedrooms playing with our computers and communicating electronically. Mr. Jeffrey. I am on film, aren't I? You'll never speak to me again. So thank you all very much for participating. Enormous thanks to those who've helped facilitate this, who have been lurking around the room, many of them beginning with D, Delphine and Desi, and Danny, and then there's Howard, who's the odd one out, simply because He begins with H. And so many thanks to all of them. These things don't happen by accident. And will you please join me in giving an enormous round of applause to our fantastic panelists.